Hello my friends, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh and welcome to this week's edition of The Writer's Lab. And today we'll be discussing a subject that some writers greet with a smile, but others with a roll of the eyes and a feeling of dread. What is it? Research. So let's talk research. Now, if you're writing a novel, the chances are almost certain that you will need to hit the books at some point. Sure, your story may take place in a world that you know really, really well, but do you know absolutely everything about it? And let's face it, there's no real excuse these days for not doing your research. Rather than troop down to your local library and spend a whole afternoon in dusty back rooms teasing morsels of information out of obscure old volumes, you can just use a search engine. And if you can't find exactly what you need that way, the chances are very high that you can find references to books that will tell you what you need to know. And these can often be obtained inexpensively from online retailers. Of course, you may feel you're already pretty clued up on everything you need to know for your novel. Fair enough. Good luck to you. I mean, after all, does it really matter if you get a minor fact wrong here or there? I mean, if, for example, you include a scene set in 1910 that features a type of locomotive that didn't actually come into service until 2 years later, is anyone going to notice? Does it matter if they do? Well, not hugely, no. You might upset a handful of experts who happen to read it, but it's a work of fiction after all. But you do have to be careful that there aren't larger gaps in your knowledge, that you aren't in possession of any false assumptions or facts learned long ago that are now refuted by experts. And how difficult would it be to check those things anyway and make sure you've got them right? As I said already, not very. And other than accuracy, there's another important thing that research gives you that can't be underestimated. Confidence. Coming from a place of knowledge, your work is likely to brim with it, and that helps to sell the authenticity of your story. Any trace of uncertainty in your work undermines its effectiveness. You are creating a world in which you want your audience to invest. Don't you want to give them the best chance to do that and to enjoy the experience as well? And research gives you something else, another advantage. You are learning, and the more knowledge that goes into your head, the more ideas are generated. Life experience and learning are the main things that provide that elusive spark of inspiration. For example, let's say your story features a windmill. It's only in a couple of scenes and it's not really central to the plot, but you realise it would be good to have an insight into what the interior of the building might look like, how the mechanism would work, and how windmills fitted into the local industry and village life of the time when your novel is set. So you do the reading, and behold, another story idea pops up, unrelated to your novel, yes, but to be filed away for later use. In short, research is a good thing. But there are pitfalls, and to my mind, two major ones. The first is simple: getting carried away. Now, if you're a writer who's anything like me, then you're always looking for an excuse not to sit down at the keyboard. There's a shelf I need to put up, some painting I need to do, that cupboard next door needs sorting out, etc., etc. It's called prevarication, and research is a perfect excuse to prevaricate. Because you might not be actually writing your novel, but you are working on it, right? And you might find the subject in question is fascinating too. It might get you hooked. You're really enjoying the thrill of learning all about it. But there comes a point when you have to stop yourself and ask the question: is all this research still serving the story that you need to tell? Has it become an excuse not to start? Has it become an end in itself, an enjoyable pursuit, a comfort blanket maybe? At some point you have to draw the line and say, I know enough now. It's time to use that knowledge. It's time to write. Now, the second major danger is how you use the knowledge that you've gained, how you present it to your audience within your novel. And here you always need to bear in mind that your own interests will not necessarily be the same as theirs. A subject that you find absolutely fascinating might bore them to tears. Now, there was a very famous author in the 1930s and 1940s called James M Cain. He wrote hugely successful and iconic thrillers such as The Postman Always Rings Twice, Double Indemnity and Mildred Pierce, and these are some of my favourite books. But by the 1950s he was struggling to find an audience. So he began work on an American Civil War epic called Mignon, which focused on a scheme to fund the military efforts of the South, the plan being to hijack a rich consignment of cotton. Now, Cain worked on this novel for almost a decade, and it's obvious that he carried out a staggering amount of research to make the scheme both believable and firmly grounded in history. And in those things, he's wildly successful. But the book was a commercial disaster. Why? Because it's unbelievably tedious. There isn't even an action scene when the hijacking of the cotton takes place. It's accomplished by the forging of bills of sale, receipts and invoices. Yes, it's a novel about paperwork and admin procedure. All very authentic, all very believable, but very, very boring. Now here's another real-life example of a poor way to use the results of your research. Now, Jules Verne has a reputation for copying huge amounts of information from encyclopedias in order to provide the background details for his exotic stories. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In essence, he's just doing research in the same way as any writer would do it. The issue is how he uses that information and how he integrates it into his narrative. So let's have a quick read of a scene from 800 Leagues on the Amazon, an adventure novel published in 1881. Now this is an excerpt of a conversation between two of the principal characters, Manuel and Benito, and I shall use a hat to indicate when Benito is speaking. Let's see how this goes. And along its whole extent, continued Manuel, like the 1,000 tentacles of some gigantic pulp, 200 tributaries flowing from north or south, themselves fed by smaller affluents without number, by the side of which the large rivers of Europe are but petty streamlets. And in its course 560 islands, without counting islets, drifting or stationary, forming a kind of archipelago even, yielding of themselves the wealth of a kingdom. And among its flanks canals, lagoons and lakes, such as cannot be met with even in Switzerland, Lombardy, Scotland or Canada. A river which, led by its myriad tributaries, discharges into the Atlantic over 250 millions of cubic meters of water every hour. A river whose course serves as the boundary of 2 republics and sweeps majestically across the largest empire of South America, as if it were, in very truth, the Pacific Ocean itself flowing out along its own canal into the Atlantic. And what a mouth, an arm of the sea in which one island, Marajo, has a circumference of more than 500 leagues, and whose water the ocean does not pond back without raising in a strife which is phenomenal and that was just an excerpt of their conversation. Now, I don't have any problem with the style or language here, just that the huge amount of geographical information that is supplied and how it's delivered. The Amazon is big and it's long, we get it. Even assuming your readers do not know this, there are far better ways of getting that information across. Now, Verne is trying to set the scene, of course, but his method is hopelessly clumsy and really risks boring the reader. What makes this scene even worse in the context of the story is that Benito and Manuel are lifelong friends who have grown up together on the banks of the river, making their conversation more than a little ridiculous. Also, there is nothing happening in this scene, no action of any kind, however slight. It serves no purpose in the advancement of the plot, and we find out nothing new about the characters beyond the fact that both of them are in possession of a lot of statistical information about the Amazon. I think you get my point. This is not the best way to use the results of your research in a novel. Now, as a contrast to this, let's take an example where I felt the research was used quite well. Unfortunately, it is one of my works. Now, I'm not trying to compare myself favourably with a writer like Verne or self-promote one of my novels, but I'm aware of the thought that went into this particular scene and what my intentions were. So it's far easier to speak to that rather than making assumptions about another author's process. So, in my novel Dogs on the Highway, two small British criminals join a private security force based at an isolated chateau in the mountains in the middle of nowhere in Europe. Now, there were several things that I wanted to establish right off the bat. Firstly, that my heroes were not very competent and did not possess the special set of skills required for such work. Secondly, that this was both a working facility and a community where people lived their day-to-day, ordinary lives. And thirdly, that this was an armed organisation competent enough to go up against the NATO task force later on in the story. Now, I chose to do this by having an early scene where the heroes are taught basic weapons handling, how to draw a gun, how to aim it, how to fire. Having never even held a firearm, I needed to do some serious research. And in doing so, obviously I found out the basic do's and don'ts of the procedure. So I was able to achieve my first objective easily, to show my heroes' lack of competence by having them make these most obvious mistakes. Now, the scene also takes place in an underground target range where other shooters come and go, and at one point the main character wanders over to a bulletin board which contains duty rosters, procedural notices, fire safety information and details of social events and activities taking place within the complex. He also sees an armoury station where soldiers can use tools to upgrade their weapons. And this all helps to establish that this is a living and breathing community, and the work that some of its inhabitants are engaged upon. Also, by having a confident and knowledgeable training instructor, this helps convince that this is a competent fighting force. I even threw in some extra information about cross-eye dominant shooting. Google it if you're interested, which I'm sure is common knowledge to anyone involved with firearms, but not so much to those coming from a position of complete ignorance like me or my heroes. Also, they're acquiring skills, so their competence in this area later on in the novel does not come right out of left field. So hopefully all this assists with the credibility of the story. The sequence is also fairly brief, so it does not overstay its welcome and allows for some small character moments. And because this is basic firearms training, it does not overburden the reader with a lot of more involved and lengthy information that the story does not need them to know. And most importantly of all, the heroes are actually doing something. They're not passive or just exchanging information in conversation. Something is happening. And the results of my research are integrated into the narrative not as padding, but to make some small points that the story does require. And that's the crucial lesson to my mind, that you only include the facts from your research that serve the story. This can be indirectly, of course, such as for the build-up of atmosphere or suspense, but their inclusion must have a purpose and needs to be part of an active narrative, not a passive one. And if you do have a lot of facts that you need your audience to know, try to avoid swamping them. Figure out ways to deliver information over time, rather than in one indigestible lump. The story will flow better and your readers are more likely to remain engaged. So those are my thoughts on the subject of research. I hope you found them helpful. Please like and share and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video, and feel free to start a conversation in the comments below. So I'll see you next time, and for now, please stay safe, stay well, and don't be a stranger.